So why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for you joining us this afternoon for session 2 of this webinar series on capacity building around demographic data. As folks get in the room and get set up and get comfortable, just again want to welcome you and to the second session of a series that is being sponsored by a collaboration of 3 foundations: the James Irvine Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and the California Endowment. If you joined us for the first session, you got a little bit of background on the collaboration, which I will share a tiny bit again just to reinforce. But you will know that we are getting into the meat of what we want to share with you about strengthening nonprofit capacity to engage, to collect and use demographic data. So again, just to remind folks about what the California Demographic Data Collaboration is. As you can see, the 3 foundations that are listed here and around the table, and whom some of you heard from in more detail at the last session, work collaboratively in a number of areas in a number of ways, and realized that they had a lot of overlapping grantees and organizations in common, asking, and while they have different priorities and different focus areas and different processes, there really was a lot of overlap and a shared commitment to equity and justice. And so they decided to come together to think about ways that they could streamline their procedures and their information, the data that they request from nonprofits, particularly since there was so much overlap, to not only ease the burden that nonprofits faced with reporting to so many different kinds of entities, but also to strengthen the capacity to make better use of the data. Because what we learned was when each individual foundation or entity collects data from nonprofits, that data is often quite siloed and proprietary, and it's not really used to its full capacity. So that was the impetus for the collaborative. And what we leaned into was really trying to center nonprofits and their experiences and capacities in collecting this data, and really look for strategies and tools and resources that might strengthen that capacity. So that's how, that was the goal of the collaborative, and that's how this webinar series started to unfold. So as we mentioned, we scheduled 5 in this series. We started on April 25th with an emphasis on why this data is so important. Today, we want to talk to you about the what, like what are you collecting, and why is that related to what is important and how you're going to use it. So we're going to talk about taxonomies and terms and give you a little bit of history and some key pointers. And while I will be talking a bit more over the course of the next few minutes, I will be joined by my colleague, Audrey Campbell, who is the founder of Research Gurus and is a survey researcher and methodologist for many years. She worked at Gallup and IST Research, and formerly with Google, and she brings a wealth of experience with just good data collection and good tools to bring to this table. She's really been an asset to the team over the past couple of years. So we'll turn it over to Audrey toward the end, and then we can sum up and get ready for the next session. I also want to just share and remind folks that the sessions are going to be about 50 minutes. We have a little bit of leeway at the end in case you run over, but we're really trying to keep it to 50 minutes. But we heard in your feedback at the end from the survey that we shared with you in the first session, asking for how can we improve the session? What are there questions that are burning for you about these kinds of issues? We made some refinements to the process to deliberately and explicitly pause and allow for people to engage the Q&A and to ask questions. So we really encourage you to, as I go through the first part of the session, to think about questions that you may have that may surface. This is not in any way to preclude you from from jumping in if you have a question, but we're really going to create some space to make this a little bit more active. We'll save time for questions again at the end. And just to remind folks that these webinars are being recorded and they will be supplemented with curated materials and information that doesn't replicate, but reinforces and supports what's going on in the deck. And all of that will be shared at the end of the series. So if you miss something or you want to go back to something, you'll be able to have access to that. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today in a short period of time, and I just want to outline that the issues that we'll be talking about in terms of how do you classify people, what are the terms, what are the frameworks, that's actually what a taxonomy is representative of a history of dynamism and inclusion. So we'll give you a little bit of that history, but really want you to know that these are these terms and concepts and terminology and phrasing are actively and robustly being engaged by researchers across the country and really across the world. I'm actually in Philadelphia right now at a conference of survey methodologists where these topics of how do you classify people and why, how do you get the best information is really a hot topic. So it's going to be a lot to condense into a short period of time, and it won't answer all of your questions, but it's just designed to give you a sense of the reasons why this is so complex and yet still so important. And it's really going beyond the data, beyond deeper than this numbers and the checklist to really understand the complexity that is underneath identity and why that matters. And then, as I mentioned, we'll end with some concrete tips on getting good data and seeing people. In other words, getting good sound data from as many people as possible, while also trying to be as inclusive as many of you need to be, particularly in your areas and context. So I want to start with just again a reminder that a taxonomy, often confused with a survey instrument, is really just a way of classifying things. It's a classification system. It's how do you identify characteristics, in this case of individuals, and put them into groups so that you can make meaning of what those characteristics have in terms of your setting and your context. It's also important, though, to remember that it's important when you're asking the questions and framing the tools, that it's important to be clear on what you actually need to know to inform action, as opposed to what would be nice to know. And many times people go from extremes, from asking nothing and not knowing much about their stakeholders and constituents, to asking many questions of all types that are also burdensome to individuals and may or may not be insightful or relevant, but which may just be routine. So we're going to try and give you some guidance to how to navigate that and how to balance it. But we do want to emphasize, though, that the more complex questions you ask, it produces more complex data that then needs to be analyzed. And we want to avoid situations where people are asking lots of data and then not really being able or capable of using it. So balancing that actionable data with inclusion. So I'm going to stop and pause here for a moment, as we did the last time, to see what are you collecting from the last conversation. We saw that the majority of you were engaged in demographic data in some way, on your stakeholders, your leadership, your staff. What we want to do this time is ask what kinds of data, what kind of demographic data do you collect? So we've listed here some common ones that people tend to collect, but we also know that folks collect other things. So if you can go and think about the data that you collect, particularly on your stakeholders, constituents, end users, in other words, people who are outside of your organization. What are the parameters that mean something to you? And I would ask, I see a number of folks in the something else box, if you can put in the chat what that something else is, that would be super helpful, because then we can see what else is of interest to folks. So just drop it in the chat. Again, it's not designed to be scientific, but it is designed to give some indication of the range of things, characteristics that are of interest to folks. So as we're getting more people replying, some of the responses and the weighting of the responses is actually common in what we see in other settings and across the board, is that a lot of folks are collecting and focused on race and ethnicity, and in many cases gender. Folks are putting in the chat immigrant, age, languages, all of those are very common. What we also see is much considerably less collection of sexual orientation and ability. Of course, that's for a combination of reasons, and over the course of the series, we'll engage the implications of some of those parameters. But this is very common when you think about your constituents. These are parameters that you need to know. So we got about 76% participated. It looks like it's slowing down. So that's super helpful. And when I think, let's see, just share the results. So folks can see, again, as we said, it's mostly race and ethnicity, not far behind gendered identity, sexual orientation, ability, even less so. And something else in the chat is showing us age, immigrant status, language, what have you. So the next slide, I want to give you yet another poll, if you will, real quick, not to belabor this, but we do want to ask what do you collect on your staff and leadership? That is slightly different from what people are collecting on their constituents. And I'm having a little trouble getting the poll to launch. It keeps sharing me the results. Oh, here we go. So here's the poll for your staff and leadership. So again, a different set of stakeholders, similar kinds of parameters. What, if any, data do you collect on those stakeholders in your organization? In other words, what is it about yourself and your organization that you collect? As we go through not only the session today, but also in subsequent sessions, we will talk a little bit about what is the relationship between the characteristics of your staff and leadership and your parameters. Anything else in the chat in terms of something else that you share on your leadership, years at the institution? That's super helpful. Is it are they representative potentially of the stakeholders that you're serving? And it also looks like there's a lesser number of folks potentially who are collecting information on their own organization. So we'll talk a little bit about the implications of that. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results real quick, so people can see again, a little bit of alignment, mostly race and ethnicity, gender identity, less so sexual orientation and ability, and in some cases something else. So I wanted to put this out there so that people can kind of see where is the energy in terms of these demographic parameters. And often it is around the hot topics of race and gender, less so to sexual orientation, but actually what we know in California, it's actually a little bit more common for people to engage around sexual identity and sexual orientation. And we'll talk about how a lot of these parameters and terms depend on generational factors as well. So taxonomies in general, as you know, I call it the tyranny of the taxonomy, because it really is a classification system that has been going on since the beginning of the country, when people had very simple parameters around which they collected data on. But as you can see from this graphic, over the years, it has gotten more and more granular and more complex. As the nature of the country and the demographics of the country have changed, so has the classifications and the ways in which the country is collecting information on who is existing. And as you may be aware, there are ongoing and regular conversations in the larger public about more and more insight and awareness of the complex diversity of the country. What we're not seeing are tendencies or trends toward being all the same or one big melting pot. We're increasingly in a space where people want to be seen for who they are. Having said that, the level of granularity that often is people want to engage when thinking about the mechanism and the terms that you might collect data on, it's really important to strike that balance. And this is something that we will be going back to and reinforcing again and again, is that the terms that you use can often sometimes be very specific to population, sometimes to demographics, to constituencies. For example, in this example from grant makers in the arts about their terms that they were proposing using for gender identity includes terms that were probably very relevant to their own stakeholders and constituents. And that is critical to see who folks are and who and making sure everyone is seen. But this is not the kind of survey that might necessarily, or not the kind of terminology that might play well in a larger, what we would call general population, where there are lots of diverse folks in your population who might be experiencing these questions and queries, because in many cases for general population, this would be like getting a survey in another language. And because surveys, people spend so little time on these kinds of queries, you really want a tool that both captures a range of folks, but also allows for people to comprehend what you're asking. This is also the case and often comes up when people think about doing work in international settings or in contexts outside of the US. Often people struggle with trying to map concepts and ideas of identity that are happening in other parts of the world with those same concepts in your domestic space, in this case in the United States. And that really isn't feasible. There really isn't ever going to be the capacity to map the whole world onto an American concept of race and ethnicity, or any other parameter, even gender. And that is that complexity doesn't mean it's not important or that we shouldn't try. It just means that the work has to be done to really understand those concepts in those contexts. For example, there was a recent article in the Washington Post around how India is struggling with how to design its own census questions with respect to caste, because caste in India has implications similar to ethnic identities and disparities in other parts of the world. And that's why they need the data to address that and redress that. Similarly, in a place like South Africa, where one might assume that there are similar kinds of racial differences and constraints and histories, how South Africans really define and relate to the categories of how people are structured, and to the degree to which those categories inform policies are really different than what is happening in the United States, and would not map well. The terms would not map well here, and vice versa. I wanted to share this one framework with folks, however, around why, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity, it's so challenging to think about how to get the terms and the concepts right. And when you think about race and ethnicity, you're really asking about three aspects of identity that are important and interrelated, but you're trying to get it out of one question. So in many cases, people are thinking about the phenotype, how people are perceived or how they are engaged by the world, what researchers call street race. And you're also, in some cases, trying to engage nationality, which we know is a crucial factor in terms of identity and makeup, but it relates more to country of origin or place of origin and language. And then sometimes you want to get at ethnicity. What are the cultures, practices, norms, habits, values that people have that are associated in many cases with their country of origin or with their appearance in the world, or their manifestation in the world. But they are really distinct but interrelated concepts that people are trying to get at in one fell swoop. So I wanted to share this because I think it helps people understand why getting at some of these concepts and the terms that you can use to get at them can be so complicated. I want to also share with you the strain, the tension between, again, using these terms to see everybody. These word clouds are indicative of what people's individual responses to a survey about, on the left, race, ethnicity, on the right, sexual orientation, of a survey that was recently launched a couple of years ago by a philanthropic affinity group. And these were the write-in responses to a list of options that were presented to folks. In other words, this is what people wrote in terms of how they wanted to be identified by race and ethnicity. Obviously, the larger the word, the more people gave that answer. Similarly, on the other side, with sexual orientation, the larger word, the more people gave that answer. But as you can see, there were lots of other words and ways that people really wanted to be seen in these contexts. And when you're designing a tool that is trying to, again, be inclusive and see everybody, you would generally have to have a tool that had all of these options, which is not really feasible. However, it is important in these contexts and in these tools to allow people the option to self-identify in some other way. The term that is emerging is, I prefer to identify as something else or in some other way. It used to be other, and people felt that was dismissive. But we are in a moment where that preference to identify in some other way option is really an opportunity to learn about how your communities and constituencies are changing, and the terminologies that they are evolving and growing into. And again, some terms are repurposed, some terms are revisited and reclaimed, and that option for people to choose can really give you that insight. So we just think that folks want to pause and think about, what are you already collecting in terms of the data. We saw folks are largely engaging race and ethnicity. A lot of folks were engaging other things. The difference between intrinsic characteristics, those that folks carry with you that are often visible, that are generally immutable, versus those that are acquired as people move through the world and are moving in different social contexts. But important to think about, how do you get data that gives you the information that you want to know, and that helps you understand the intersection between these two elements? And just to give you some examples, so when you're thinking about, for example, a tenants' rights organization, a direct service organization, your goals, if you focus on what are you actually trying to change, what are you trying to impact in the world, in this case, housing stability, reduced evictions, what is the kind of demographics that may influence those outcomes or the field in general? It could be a long list. It could be lots of things that you anticipate may or may not influence. And then when you focus on who are you intending to serve or engage, that can help you focus more on how to hone in what is the taxonomy that you're actually really going to use and design. And again, what we learn and what we recommend, and probably what many of you are already finding, is that you may begin with some hypotheses or some suppositions around what's important to know. But as you go out and get information from individuals and folks, you will find that some information is more important than others. And it's okay to start to refine and reduce and streamline what is the data that's really key. Having said that, it's also important, particularly for organizations that may be national in scope, that may be more advocacy oriented, that may be trying to reach the populations at large or the general population. In many cases, folks are assuming that the demographic characteristics that they know can be pretty straightforward or generic in terms of the demographics of the country as a whole. But it can be really important to dig a little bit deeper. Are there variations geographically? Are there variations by age? Are there variations by party that may inform this? So when you think about COVID, for example, or messages about COVID, the country and the national level had a primary messenger with a primary message around the vaccine and reducing risks. But we learned over time as the pandemic unfolded that the messengers and the messages really varied a lot by community. And so it was really important and critical to have that data and that information, even when you're designing strategies that are intended to reach the whole population. I'm going to stop here and see what the questions are. And I see some things in the chat, but would love to hear if there are other questions that people want to drop in or surface.
Yeah, while we're waiting for that, Kelly, I think what you're speaking to, there are a couple of comments about recognizing that demographics are key to understanding your strategy at the beginning of designing your strategy. And it's not just about collecting data at the end of it. So
Exactly.
that seems to be something that's coming through and people are doing as well.
Exactly. And again, I'm glad someone pointed that out, and why we began with the why. What are you going to do with this data? What can you possibly change? How are you going to think about your services and programs? It's often, I won't say too late, but people often do count up what they've already done. And that's sometimes after you could have designed a different sort of intervention. But what we would argue is it's never too late to really get that information and be open to challenging some of your assumptions. I think one important thing to resist, which often happens with this data, is people are anxious that it will tell them that they're not doing something right for certain groups, when really people should be leaning into thinking about how can they get better and how can they improve.
We have a couple of questions here. One from Han. Han, do you want to speak it since you're here?
Sure. So I really like the fact that you tied data to the work that you're doing, your theory of change. What might be some reasons to collect certain demographic data, even if they don't relate to programming or strategy?
Right. Well, it's interesting to think about what people may have assumptions for about what is the demographic data that's relevant or not relevant. So, for example, I think in the last session we talked about an organization that was a women's reproductive health organization. Come to find out, so one would think that maybe gender wasn't something that you needed to probe on because it's a women's reproductive health organization. But when they did ask those questions, they found that there was a lot of gender variation, and that men were actually participating in their programs. And so it may not seem obvious on its face that you need this kind of data for your programming, but what we are learning, and what I think generally in the field of social science, in politics and health and other arenas, the parameters around race, ethnicity, gender identity, to some degree sexual orientation, certainly ability, but not exclusively those parameters, in some cases socioeconomic, have been known to be factors that really vary a lot, very consistently over lots of different interventions and lots of engagement. And so minimally, those are the kinds of things that people should be probing, but that once you start to get that kind of information into your organization, it will start to uncover potentially other kinds of demographics that might be more salient. Are older men more likely to engage our program than younger men and vice versa?
We have a few other comments, questions. Francis would love to hear more about the balance of inclusivity being seen. I know you're going to address that, you and Audra Swell, in just a bit on taxonomy tips. So Francis, just know that that's coming. And a comment, how people define identity is often much more variable than the standard taxonomies. And I think too, you'll get into that as well. So appreciate that comment also about the tenant right advocate example, which I think really reflects the range of organizations and why data is needed. So that's great too, and know that we'll be building on this as we talk about collection strategies in the next session and putting the data to use as well.
Yeah, and those are really excellent thoughts and comments from folks. And I think the point around how people identify is variable is really actually super critical. And that was why I tried to share that framework around all the different aspects of identity. And those aren't the only ones, but those are the ways, and they're variable. In other words, they're finding that people actually change over time in terms of how they think about each other. That's why the ability to allow individuals to self-identify if they want to or choose to, can surface a lot of that variability. And over time, in many cases, it does begin to aggregate up into the larger categories. So people are talking about having only limited options to put people in. As we're saying, just in the past census and going forward, several new options such as Middle Eastern and North African are emerging. There's conversations about making the Asian category more granular, and you could see that over time, as through the graphic at the census level, that is kind of the direction that people are moving in. But it does take time because you're having to balance that evolving sense of who people are and how they're defining themselves with still understanding in general what are the parameters of the population, and having data that you can then act on.
Yeah, and one more thing before you move on is just to acknowledge the frustration that there can be with the variety of ways that data is requested, and just know that the three foundations have come together to exactly address that and try to streamline and standardize as part of a movement that is growing. So I want to acknowledge that we're kind of in the middle of that process there, or we hope to be.
Exactly. I can hear the frustration coming about the balancing some folks who want to see every single parameter, and we'll talk about, how do you actually manage that data with the larger grouping things into the larger categories. It is an ongoing kind of tension, but again, to go back to the impetus for this this collaborative was, how do we start to move toward some kind of alignment while still building tools and mechanisms and processes, and part of that process is engagement directly with folks that allow for mutability and dynamism over time. So I also see a question about what foundations are doing with this data that they ask. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we will be at the end of the session. I was going to mention this at the end, but I can surface it now. The final session that is billed as the town hall, where we can have more of this robust discussion between all of you across some of these tensions and these concerns, will be an opportunity for you to talk directly with the representatives from the three collaboratives. And to the degree that they are and are not willing to speak on behalf of their peers, they can at least tell you what they're going to do. So on that note, I want to get Audrey's points in terms of some good steps around trying to navigate some of these, and then we will leave open some time for some additional questions and go from there. So Audrey is going to give you some tips on how to design your taxonomy and how to, as we said, sort of navigate some of these complexities that you're raising.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. So let's get started with a few tips. So the first one is reflecting a little bit about what we're hearing in the comments, but consider using an established taxonomy. Intentionally aligning with an established taxonomy has a lot of benefits. So one of those is that demographic experts have already consulted on the categories, because often the first step is, what do we say and what do we use? So how about we just use something that the experts have already agreed on? So that's one great thing. Another thing is you can compare your data with the field, so you can see what others are doing and how what your data says compares to others, which is great, and kind of see how you measure up. And then this third point here, which is also being talked about in the comments, is just reducing burden. The more aligned we are, the better it is. We know that a lot of nonprofit organizations are reporting to a lot of groups, and also a lot of foundations are collecting a lot of data, and it's often not aligned. So by using established taxonomies and standardizing, it helps everyone. Next slide. So this kind of gets to something Kelly was talking about earlier when she was just mentioning that, taxonomies and terminologies change over time. So My second tip is to stay current on the terminology, but know that it might change. So there's this bit of knowing what's going on, but also being, somewhat flexible. So over time, as we've seen throughout history, the way we talk about identities and groups and experiences have consistently changed, and it's not going to stop. It's going to keep changing. So something that we can do about that is just kind of, know what's going on, but determine when it's a time to make that change and when it's not, which I think can be difficult. So a few things that we would like to talk about is one, updating your demographic data on a regular basis. Instead of kind of like every time the wind blows, changing everything, have a regular cadence to your demographic update. So, maybe that's, every 2 years, once a year, whatever your organization decides, just have a regular time basis that you update it so you don't feel this scramble to change all the time. The other thing to do is think about, so at the bottom I have here, like keep in mind, think about like who you're surveying. So normally, or who you're asking these questions to, when you're doing something to the general population, which means basically, general constituents, not a subpopulation, be cautious when using terms that are not broadly understood. Often terms will emerge in subgroups and then they'll kind of at some point filter out, but it may take a while before everyone kind of understands the new terminology. So just think about, when you're saying, is it time to make a change? Think about who you're surveying or who you're collecting data on. If it's general population, think more about like, will everyone understand for this particular effort? Because if people don't understand, they might not answer it altogether because they feel lost, right? However, if you're doing something in a subgroup, then that might be a time, as Kelly showed earlier with the grant makers example, that might be a time to be a little bit more specific because that subgroup might understand those terms. And then the last thing I want to cover on this is the struggle with changing terminology and why you don't want to always do it is because you have to map responses. So if you're looking to trend your data over time, to look at how things improve or decline, every time you make changes, it impacts your trends, right? So the ability to say that things change over time really is impacted. And sometimes it doesn't measure up perfectly, right? So you add this new category, now you don't know what to do with this one. So that's another thing to think about. But when you do decide to make the change, as closely as possible, try to map those responses. How can they kind of relate in a way that you can make sense of your progress or, declines that may have happened. Next slide. So the next thing here is keep it simple, but capture detail when you need it. So this is also kind of emerging in the chat too. So I know it kind of sounds contradictory. We're like, keep it simple, but capture detail when you need it, but you can do this, right? So what you want to do is you want to use like broad, high level categories. So someone mentioned like that their organization has like all these categories, but when it's time to report, they only need to report 5, right? So what you want to do is going back to that kind of mapping is figuring out how some of those categories roll up to what you have to report out. So those would be like your broad, high level categories. And, if you're collecting this online, you can have, the option to, if someone selects this, then it opens up to smaller questions where you can get more niche and detailed, right? So that way you have the broad categories and the data that you need, but you can still have these kind of roll up categories that you need when you're interested in specific groups. And I know this might be relevant, particularly in a state like California, where we know there's so many different groups, so many identities. And when you look at larger United States of America, they may not get that detailed, right? So you may be reporting to someone who wants something very broad, but then you need something detailed for yourself. So this kind of allows you to capture the internal data that you need, but also to easily report out categories. Next slide. So the next thing we want to talk about is to consider like basically asking race and ethnicity together and also consider using markup that apply. I'll talk a little bit about race and ethnicity first. So the US Census has been doing a lot of research and they found that when we combine race and ethnicity together, it improves data quality and particularly for those who identify with the Hispanic or Latino identity. Generally speaking, when we see race, that is one question. Ethnicity just talks about normally in America, Hispanic identity. And so, but what ends up happening is when we combine it together instead of asking it separately, we find that fewer people skip questions and also fewer people select other, right? Because race and ethnicity is sometimes not as separate as we might think they are. For a lot of individuals, they're actually a little bit more murky. And so we get better data when we put race and ethnicity together instead of just separating it apart. And then in terms of mark all that apply, this also kind of relates to something in the comments, which is like, how do we make sure people are seen, but we're still getting the data that we need? So mark all that apply is really something that helps those who, may identify as multiracial or have a variety of backgrounds, right? Even as we go back generations, we might have different ethnic identities. So sometimes this allows individuals to be able to express the range of identities that they see themselves. However, this does add complexity, right? So some things to think about is when you do combine race and ethnicity together, it can be a challenge when you compare this to two separate questions, right? How do you compare two separate questions to one, right? So you may need someone who understands data analysis a little bit, how to, make two questions one and comparable. The other thing to think about is when you do mark all that apply, you'll have to do a little bit more work with reporting. So you won't be able, so if the person you're reporting to says multiracial, but I have mark all that apply, then I have to figure out which ones are multiracial, then how do I, take those away so I can get the actual true percentage. So it does increase complexity. So that is something that we want to keep in mind. Even though some of these are best practices, you may want to consider what your capacity is as an organization and what you're able to take on. Next slide. So then this one here is particularly just kind of talking about separating out sexual orientation, gender identity, and transgender, particularly when you're hoping to measure different things. So sometimes on surveys, we might just see a question that says, do you identify with the LGBTQ plus community? Which, at first glance might say, oh, this is a fine question. The issue with that question can be that oftentimes that acronym captures a lot of different things, right? So we're talking about sexual orientation in that acronym. We're also talking about gender identity, and we're also talking about transgender status, right? So it's so much going on within the acronym that if you want to get more quality data on the specific issues, it's best to kind of separate it out and ask them separately. So there is a trend kind of moving towards asking about one's sexual orientation, then asking about one's gender identity, and then transgender status. Oftentimes we'll see sexual orientation and transgender looped together, but there has been research that found that individuals who are transgender, I think it's a little bit over 60%, will often identify as heterosexual or straight, right? So depending on what you're trying to measure, if you want the best quality data, it's often best to kind of separate them out. Next slide. And so the next tip we just want to talk about is, making sure that we include a decline to state or choose not to disclose option for every question. Even though we're, sharing all these things, we understand that there are going to be some individuals who, for their own reasons decide that they don't want to report this information. And, one thing in the research community or collecting data community, that demographic data should always be voluntary at the individual level. So what we mean at the individual level is an organization will ask it, but individuals should still have that option to choose not to disclose, right? So if you're required to report, you have to report, but you can give individuals a space to say, I choose not to disclose. So we always want to give them the option to opt out if this is not something they want to say. And that's also good data, right? Knowing that someone doesn't want to report is also good data. So you kind of want to know how many people in your organization don't want to report. As it kind of just says here, like some individuals, even if the survey is anonymous, because, there is this idea that if we make it anonymous, then, everyone's going to participate. But even if it's anonymous, some individuals still don't want to participate and they still don't want to disclose. So giving them the option not to disclose is very helpful. And so, as I said, if you're required to report, when you report out your results, you can just include a box in there that, about, 25% of individuals, chose not to disclose or not to report. And as I said, that's great data for everyone to know, who's not interested in responding, but it also gives, it's just great research ethics for individuals and allowing them to opt out too. Next slide. So this is just an example of like balancing this idea of like, less detail and more detail. And I'll pass it back to Kelly after this. So, if she wants to add on some more, but as you can see, one example is, a little bit less detail. Still kind of full, but less detail. But you'll see the more detailed category when it comes to Asian American / Asian, there's like these roll up categories. And this is where you're able to roll up. And so you have like that general, so you can report what you need, but for your own organization, you can have the detail that you need. And as I mentioned, if you are able to collect this information online, it could look a little cleaner, because then you could just have, an option that if someone selects Asian American / Asian, then it opens up these other categories. So everyone doesn't have to see that, and it doesn't have to be as messy. And so I'll turn it back over to Kelly at this time.
Thanks, Audra. That was super helpful and full, and folks will get the deck. And I think I wanted to make a couple of points before we started to wrap up, and again, see if there are any final questions before we prep for next time. And that is, there is a very real tension, and we're trying to give people the support to help navigate that. But these granularity versus aggregate, these are tensions that people are and demographers are really trying to navigate as people themselves sort of evolve and as communities kind of grow and change. That's the journey that we're all on, which is why it's so important to engage and to understand. Having said that, so for example, the race and ethnicity category, as she mentioned, race / ethnicity is helpful for the Hispanic population, or was Hispanic. Race and ethnicity is really more salient for the Middle Eastern, North African communities, because their notion of race and ethnicity are different. And so there really isn't a right answer with that. It's not either and or, but and depending on the context, it's both. I think to the point also that was in the chat around what are people requesting, foundations and others requesting with respect to a level of granularity. I think this is where there's a real opportunity to have good conversations about what do people actually need. Like just when we started it early on, what are people going to actually do with this level of granularity? And on the one end, when I gave the example about the grant makers, certainly there was some reason to understand people in that fullness, but sometimes it's knowing all of the different kind of multiracials may not be helpful. It may be helpful, but it may not. It may be interesting, but it may not be helpful. In other words, it may not be data that you're actually going to use. And so our foundations and others requesting information that is interesting and perhaps insightful, but may not actually lead to strategies or actions, at least at any given point in time. And then so I just wanted to point those out before we move into the sum up and open it up to the chat and see what are your takeaways from this conversation that went very quickly, and let's see what folks have to say. I saw something in the chat there. Megan, is there?
Yeah, well, we have a great recommendation of or affirmation that foundations should include a statement in their request explaining why they ask for data and how they use it. There is a lot of mystery in foundations, and we know that. And I know these 3 foundations are actively trying to break that down.
And also to break down, as as Audrey was referring to and others referring to, is there is this tension around reporting and knowing, sort of reporting and understanding. Like on some level, reporting is important. We just had a conversation earlier today with someone who does a lot of work with HUD, and they're very, very, very data driven and very, very granular, but they use that data to inform their strategies. They need that granularity on individuals. So, but in many cases, folks really need to understand what is the impetus around reporting, reporting to whom and for what and to what end. Really needs to be a conversation between those who are requesting and those are providing, because it could be that organizations like yourselves who are around this table need a certain level of granularity, maybe more or less than the entities that you report this data to. So I think there's an opportunity, and hopefully we can do this as we move forward. Let's start that conversation so that the alignment that we're trying to work for is alignment for everybody, not just alignment among foundations, but alignment within the sector.
Yeah, we have another comment from Francis, and you're great at segues, recommendations for easing the burden on answering for a group. So that will be covered in collection strategies. in our next session. So thank you for that. I'm also going to put our survey in the chat. It's just a 1-minute survey to give us some feedback, which we'd appreciate.
Yes, we really appreciated the feedback that folks gave from the last survey, and we're trying to, depending on based on kind of the nature of the content, try to again make the sessions a little bit more active and a little bit more relevant. But they are feeding on each other, and then the next session 2 weeks from now, we are going to talk a little bit more about, once you sort of have a sense of the terms and a sense of the granularity, how do you actually get the data? How do you talk to people about it? How do you convince them to give it to you? The difference between survey data, aggregate survey data, and administrative data, privacy issues, storing it, things like that, so that people understand that while it seems onerous and burden and can be upfront in the beginning, it really is something that's manageable, and it's manageable particularly if people understand how they're going to use it and why they need it. So, and the next session is on the 26th. The 23rd of May, and after that, we'll have a session on June 6th where we're more deeply engaged in using the data, probably with some case studies and some examples. We hope to give you a little bit of a high-level oversight on, what are some of the legal issues, what are the things you can't use the data for or shouldn't use the data for. And then, as I mentioned, we'll wrap up in June with the open questions for each other and for the foundation parameters. So on that note, we're a little 1 minute over our 50 minutes. We really appreciate folks coming and attending and hanging in there. We really ask you to fill out the survey, give us your feedback so we can continue to refine. We will be sharing the information at the end of the series, but we're really trying to curate it as we go along so it answers as much of your questions as possible. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to say thanks to everyone, and see you in 2 weeks.